It all started in December 2011 in Russia. Since the beginning of the month, the population had been gathering in the streets of the largest cities of the country.
У меня есть надежда о том, что хоть что-то изменится. То, что они уже там своровали все, что можно было своровать, начнут хотя бы хоть что-то делать для других.
Their anger was driven by corruption, the fraud that had tainted the recent legislative elections, and above all, Vladimir Putin's bid for a third term as leader of the Kremlin. The level of dissent was unprecedented.
You had a huge number of Russians taking to the streets in freezing temperatures because it was winter in Russia. During these protests, there was a noticeable sense of freedom in the air, which was honestly surprising and not unpleasant, because generally speaking, people in Russia are very cautious and reserved when discussing politics, because it's something that's considered as grimy and dangerous, and then all of a sudden, people started speaking passionately about it.
At the time, the slogans that were making the rounds were mostly accusatory. You'd often hear, "Putin is a thief."
The first signs of organized protest in Russia appeared on social media platforms. Groups on Facebook and its Russian counterpart, VKontakte, began to emerge, uniting a determined community.
We will make a stand on Freedom Square against the policies of the party of crooks and thieves.
Tell your friends, acquaintances, and relatives. Tomorrow, let's defend our civil rights together.
On social media, the protests were organized as events to which people could RSVP with interested or going. And then there would be a snowball effect, in the sense that if 10 people were participating, others would be hesitant to join because there had already been arrests at previous protests. But if the participant count climbed to 10,000 or 50,000, even if not everyone actually showed up, people would think that it was a major event.
The Russian authorities, who didn't have full control of social media yet, were caught off guard by this new form of rallying.
In other words, when the protesters organized these demonstrations via social media such as Facebook, which date back to 2007-2008, the Russian security services found themselves completely unable to predict where the next protest would be held.
As a result, on December 24, 2011, close to 130,000 people took to the streets in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
The Russian government was deeply concerned about this, especially in the context of the Arab Spring, which had taken place less than a year before and where the role of social media had been widely discussed.
We know that he had expressed concern and fear of being violently overthrown and assassinated at the time.
But from that moment on, the Russian government realized that if the internet and social media remained uncontrolled, they would pose a threat to its survival and to its stability.
5 months later, Putin was re-elected for the third time with over 63% of the vote in the first round. The former KGB member decided to turn a blind eye to the protests. On May 7, 2012, he left his position as prime minister, which he had held for 4 years, and returned to the Kremlin. To prevent any possible disruptions, President Putin tightened his grip on the opposition.
On that day, Moscow was on lockdown. This meant that people were not allowed to leave their homes, especially those who lived in the city center. There was just this one convoy making its way through empty streets and finally arriving at the Kremlin. It was a very eerie and unsettling sight.
Putin thought to himself, these young people in their 20s and 30s don't want me, so I can't count on them. I'm not going to try to please them, so I just won't make any effort at all. So from 2012 onwards, he decided to adopt a completely conservative policy.
Ближайшие годы будут определяющими для судьбы России на десятилетия вперед.
His return to power marked a turning point. Convinced that Western democracies were stirring up opposition in his country, he decided to go on the offensive. His goal, to destabilize these Western countries, which he believed were the main culprits behind the fracture of Greater Russia.
I remember the first time we met very well. We were at the Élysée shortly after my own election, and above all, shortly after his return to power. And there I quickly understood that Vladimir Putin was not in the same predicament as before. It's likely that he was restless and impatient during those 4 years he spent as Prime Minister. So I realized that I no longer had a Vladimir Putin who wanted to earn respect in front of me, but a Vladimir Putin who was on the offensive.
In the offices on Red Square, the Kremlin officials were preparing for the next battle. A slow and discreet global offensive, like a web being woven. This offensive combines ground operations and disinformation. This is what we call a hybrid war.
A hybrid war is a multifaceted war, where there's a conventional warfare aspect with troops fighting on the ground. At the same time, there's an information war, with the fighting taking place on a virtual background, like the internet.
To reach the widest possible audience with its fake news and propaganda, the Kremlin realized it must modernize its tools of influence and weaponize social media. It was the start of a new Cold War in the smartphone era, and the Kremlin had already found its first target. February 18, 2014. In Maidan Square, Kyiv, pro-European protesters are demanding the resignation of Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president with close ties to the Kremlin. After 3 months of protests, the center of the Ukrainian capital turned into a battlefield. After 3 days of non-stop fighting, 80 people lost their lives. On February 21st, the president ended up fleeing the capital.
In 2010, a pro-Russian president was elected here, and he stayed in his office for almost 3 years. And the revolution of dignity, people were mad with him because there were so many obvious examples of corruption. So people just went on the streets and they pushed him out of country. They said, we don't want this president anymore.
In Moscow, the Russian government had just lost an ally. In response to the provocation of a neighboring country seeking closer ties with the West, Vladimir Putin swiftly took action. 3 days later, on February 27th, the situation in southern Ukraine took a dramatic turn as Crimea was engulfed in turmoil. In the streets, the locals witnessed the presence of armed men without any visible identification as they tried to understand what was happening.
The events that unfolded in Crimea are the physical manifestation of the concept of hybrid warfare. This is something that hadn't been seen before, and this physical manifestation took the form of these little green men, which are essentially Russian soldiers who disguise themselves and operate covertly, allowing for plausible deniability.
No one was fooled, yet there seemed to be nothing standing in the way of the Kremlin's soldiers as they seized control of the parliament and government buildings in the Ukrainian peninsula.
The truth of the matter is that Russia invaded Ukraine, a sovereign nation, and annexed its territory, marking the first time since World War II that such an aggressive act had taken place.
In order to justify the annexation of Crimea, Putin pursued his hybrid war and entered a new phase of his plan by making claims that Ukraine was under the control of Nazis.
The image of Nazis, it's embedded somewhere very deep into the subconscious. And of course, this is from the times of the Soviet Union. And this is the myth that Putin uses to glue together Russian society.
Massive anti-Nazi posters appeared all across Crimea, The Kremlin story was that the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine was being victimized and oppressed.
Тем временем в южные регионы России прибывает все большее число граждан Украины, которых обострение внутриполитической ситуации вынудило покинуть страну.
Russian state channels reported that a significant number of Ukrainians were even attempting to flee to Russia. They claimed that these individuals were doing so to escape from radicals, which is the term they used to describe the Nazis. During March 2014, Ruslan Denishenko, who had recently co-founded a media organization with other journalists to counteract Russian disinformation, was surprised by the sudden influx of people.
So what I did, I just called the Federal Migration Service of Russia and asked them, can you provide me with exact numbers? How many refugees you have? How many thousands of Ukrainian refugees you have?
Это все из Украины, так?
Да, из Украины. 5 человек уже написали заявление на получение статуса беженца. Это в основном молодые люди.
As the days went by, misinformation continued to spread and gain traction on social media.
So we observed a lot of fakes and disinformation on these TV networks. We realized that Russians created the huge propaganda machine to brainwash Ukrainians, to influence public opinions, and basically it was an extension of their foreign policy.
At the beginning of March, Vladimir Putin publicly announced the annexation of Crimea during a staged referendum.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие крымчане, севастопольцы, после тяжелого, длительного, изнурительного плавания Крым и Севастополь возвращаются в родную гавань.
The West declared the annexation as illegitimate and imposed sanctions in response to Russia. But ultimately, they let it happen.
Propaganda served the purpose of relieving European leaders of any pressure to take action. This is why it was so widely accepted in 2014. Everyone in Western Europe was content to downplay the severity of the situation.
By falsely claiming that Ukraine was under the control of Nazis, the groundwork was laid for Putin to pursue his ongoing military aggression.
As we know, a lot of Russian citizens who saw these reports, they left their families, they left their jobs, and they went to Ukraine. They took machine guns and weapons. They wanted to kill Ukrainians. So that's how the real bloody conflict started.
After the events in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin now had greater flexibility to extend support to another enemy of the West. On September 30th, 2015, Russian military planes conducted airstrikes against opposition forces in Syria. This marked the first time Russia had launched a military attack outside of Europe since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In reality, Vladimir Putin had been backing Bashar al-Assad for years and providing his Syrian ally with unwavering support.
What's more, it was common knowledge that whenever the Bashar al-Assad regime was under investigation for the acts of repression it committed against its own people, there would always be a Russian veto in the Security Council.
Prior to the bombings, his support manifested itself primarily through a battle of competing narratives. In August 2013, when the Syrian army carried out a chemical attack on its own people, despite the compelling footage and undeniable evidence of the atrocities, Vladimir Putin chose to deny the truth.
Но у нас нет данных о том, что эти химические вещества, еще неизвестно, это оружие химическое, или были применены именно сирийской официальной правительственной армией.
When Bashar al-Assad's regime bombed entire neighborhoods of Damascus with chemical weapons, Vladimir Putin claimed that it was not Assad who was responsible for the attack, but rather the opposition that had used the chemical weapons to create a tragedy that would justify a response against Assad, who was innocent. For a lie to be effective, it needs to be brutal, to be blunt. You need to assert something that seems unbelievable at first. In that way, it can eventually become plausible and gain credibility.
The West had warned of military action if chemical weapons were used, but eventually decided not to follow through with their threat.
The fact that we handed Syria over so easily, that to him was basically a sign that actually there was no limit to what he could achieve.
With this sense of disregard in mind, Vladimir Putin sent aircrafts over Syrian opposition neighborhoods for the first time in August 2015. The bombings were well documented by the White Helmets, a group of civilian rescue workers.
The White Helmets are Syrians who decided to band together to form rescue teams, and they would rush to save people trapped in the rubble after every bombing. They're a group of civilians who provide emergency assistance.
The White Helmets were effective at spreading the word about the regime's atrocities against the opposition to the world through social media. They were often the first to arrive on the scene of the bombings and the first to film the devastation. The Kremlin saw the White Helmets as a danger to their media strategy. They quickly responded with a smear campaign, spreading misinformation on social media that accused the White Helmets of being terrorists.
It was very important for them to discredit the White Helmets, since they had the ability to provide information that would show viewers the reality of the Russian attacks in Syria in support of President Assad.
This time, to spread its narrative, the Russian government found a new ally, a certain Vanessa Beeley.
We have numerous photographs showing them armed, showing them basically acting as terrorists and then quickly putting on the white helmet when they're needed to make another promotional video. They are not the trained paramedics that they claim to be.
She was a British national and the daughter of a diplomat who presented herself as an independent journalist. However, she didn't hide her close ties with Bashar al-Assad and Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
She went and stayed in Syria for a very long time. She belongs to a class of people who have mastered etiquette and social norms in terms of creating a narrative through storytelling and social media, but she is a propagandist in the strictest sense of the term.
She used various platforms such as her blog, Russian state media, and Twitter to launch a series of attacks against the White Helmets, casting doubt on the nature of their actions and the source of their funding.
She was using Western customs to reproduce what could be called Russian and Syrian propaganda, aimed at a more Western and especially English-speaking audience, since she herself was a native English speaker.
Her message quickly gained traction, and a network of influencers followed in her footsteps and began to spread the misinformation worldwide.
They're white helmets by day and terrorists by night. You see many of these people...
With the help of Canadian Eva Bartlett and the Australian Tim Anderson, their videos and the messages they represented were shared thousands of times over on social media. The strategy of sowing doubt was proven to be successful, which meant the Kremlin could apply it to other areas of the political spectrum, such as the electoral process in particular. March 8th, 2016 in Florida, USA.
Hopefully tonight we're going to have the beginning of what is going to be, in a certain way, a very positive revolution. I mean, this will be a very, very positive revolution. We're going to take our country back, and we are going to make America great again.
Donald Trump, who had been running for president for a few months, was already promising to his supporters that he would remove the Democrats in power. However, at this point in the campaign, few commentators actually believed that he had a real chance of getting to the White House.
So beautiful.
Thousands of kilometers away at the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin saw an opportunity not to be missed, that of a new providential ally.
Trump didn't care about the democratic institutions because they portrayed him as deceptive and manipulative, which was very useful for propaganda. In addition to this, you've got a leader who doesn't bother with facts, which was a godsend for Putin.
To support the former real estate mogul, the Russians launched an unprecedented attack on Hillary Clinton. Over the weeks, 30,000 emails from the Democratic team were hacked, but that's not all.
It was truly shocking to learn that people acting on behalf of Russia were able to use social media, American social media at that, to try to influence an election in favor of Donald Trump.
During the campaign, a wave of misinformation from Russia flooded the Facebook feeds of American voters. Thousands of memes and posts flooded social media, targeting the Democratic candidate who had never hidden her hostility towards the Russian president.
He is trying to set European countries against one another, seizing territory, holding it in Crimea.
Behind this campaign was a man close to Vladimir Putin who was becoming increasingly powerful. Yevgeny Prigozhin, also known as the Kremlin's chef.
Yevgeny Prigozhin is a Russian businessman from St. Petersburg who made his fortune in the 1990s in the food industry. 10 years earlier, he had been sentenced to 9 years in prison for organized robbery. He became rich by opening the first hot dog stand in Leningrad in the 90s. This is someone who has always been involved with the St. Petersburg mob, which allowed him to meet people that are quite influential. It's believed that he met Vladimir Putin in the late 1990s or early 2000s.
Since then, Yevgeny Prigozhin has become a millionaire thanks to a number of public contracts and is now the head of a media empire. An empire made up of dozens of structures, including one in particular, the Internet Research Agency, a troll factory. Hundreds of employees hidden away in buildings like this one in St. Petersburg are responsible for creating fake Facebook accounts and posting messages themselves 24/7, 7 days a week.
Every day, instructions were given out by management to the employees. They were told to post a certain number of comments on specific subjects or write articles about a particular topic. It was a highly organized and coordinated operation.
During the U.S. election campaign, they had one mission: to attack Hillary Clinton and polarize public opinion by spreading misinformation.
The content was only in English and aimed at American voters to sway the vote in favor of Trump.
In just a few months, the Internet Research Agency's content had reached 126 million Americans, which is nearly half of the U.S. population. To achieve this, the Russians pretended to be Americans and used the tools provided by Facebook. They started by creating pages on social issues that appealed to a broad audience beyond the Republican demographic. To increase their reach, they paid Facebook to boost their pages and content in the news feeds of its users. This way, thousands of Americans were unknowingly exposed to content produced by the Russians and ended up subscribing to their page.
Their goal was always to disseminate misinformation from within the opposing side in order to undermine trust, particularly in the democratic system and the current governments in power.
As the election drew closer, the trolls didn't just create anti-Hillary campaigns. From St. Petersburg, they purposefully provoked clashes by organizing demonstrations on American soil by creating Facebook events. In places such as Georgia, Buffalo, Baltimore, and in Texas, where they not only organized a pro-Islam rally, but also a counter-demonstration on the same day, at the same time, on the opposite pavement.
This was a well-planned operation carried out by a state entity, which ultimately achieved its goal of disrupting the entire world and allowing a particular side to access power.
Donald Trump was elected as president on November 8, 2016. Vladimir Putin knew that he had just scored a major victory in the US. The Kremlin was now poised to target other Western democracies. After the events in the US, European nations were beginning to grow weary of Russia. In England, anti-Brexiters accused the Russians of interfering in favor of the UK's departure from the European Union. In Germany, the Russians were suspected of fueling increasingly violent anti-migrant movements with misinformation. In France, when En Marche's team emails were hacked during the second round of the presidential election between the far right and Emmanuel Macron, suspicions also turned towards Moscow.
Quand des organes de presse répandent des contre-vérités infamantes, ce ne sont plus des journalistes, ce sont des organes d'influence.
The Russians were smart enough to exploit every weakness. They understood that the best course of action was to use all possible methods to fuel the chaos that already existed.
Over the next few months, the Russian spiderweb extended its reach across Europe and was now gaining traction in Spain. Barcelona, October 2017. A crisis of unprecedented magnitude was unfolding in Catalonia. The atmosphere was tense on the eve of a crucial referendum on the region's status, with clashes between police and demonstrators becoming more and more frequent.
The situation in Catalonia was explosive. The Catalans were being called to vote in a self-determining referendum that the Spanish government claimed was illegal. The referendum held no legal value.
3,500 kilometers away in Moscow, the propaganda machine saw an opportunity to exploit this rift and further stoke tensions between Madrid and Barcelona.
Это что, европейский Майдан?
Вот все это теперь, конечно, очень сильно напоминает гражданскую войну. Что будет? Какими будут ответные меры Мадрида?
Y la cobertura era They were declaring that Spain was on the verge of a new civil war, referring to the Spanish Civil War of 1936. And they suggested that it was nothing less than a continuation of history, and that it was highly likely that the crisis would end violently.
The Russians used their state media, Russia Today and Sputnik, to light up social media by sharing messages in English and Spanish. They put out posts condemning Madrid's abuse of power and highlighted police violence.
It's quite remarkable to see that a media outlet like RT in Spanish was the most shared and active media for a few days, much more so than Spanish media itself, and that's not normal.
One way the Kremlin pushed these messages was by deploying an army of Twitter robots, also known as bots. Bots are different from trolls in that they're not humans, but rather computer programs that create fake profiles on social media platforms in large numbers. From the beginning of the crisis, accounts were created. These accounts impersonated real people using stolen profile pictures from the internet and names that often include numbers. They tweeted Russian content hundreds of times a day. As a result, Russian posts on Twitter were viewed over 125 million times. On October 1st, 2017, the Catalans voted in favor of independence, sparking a confrontation between Madrid and Barcelona. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Kremlin continued to exert pressure and sent 2 representatives, including a certain Nikolai Sadovnikov, a former Kremlin diplomat, to Catalonia almost a month later. Their mission was to meet with the president of Catalonia, Carles Puigdemont.
Sources confirmed that on the same day, the 26th, a certain Nikolai Sadovnikov arrived in Barcelona on a flight from Moscow. And this Nikolai was very interested in what was happening.
The man in charge of organizing the meeting was Victor Taradeas, Carles Puigdemont's advisor on international relations.
Victor Taradeas is someone who has been running an international cooperation NGO for years and still does, and has contacts in many countries.
Victor Taradeas knows Russia well and has connections with close advisors of Vladimir Putin.
On October 23rd, two men contacted me. They asked me if I could arrange a meeting with President Puigdemont. I called President Puigdemont and I said, Mr. President, can you meet with these men when it's convenient for you? And he said yes.
The meeting took place 3 days later, on October 26, 2017, at the Casa de Canongia, the official residence of the President of Catalonia. The discussion revolved around the region's independence.
We talked about various things. They wanted to know how the process was unfolding and what had been done during all these years. The Russians did indeed say that once independence was declared, they could provide assistance. They offered financial assistance and 10,000 Russian soldiers. That was the proposal.
An army and a huge sum of money. The Russians were offering $500 billion in order to add fuel to the fire and convince the Catalans to speed up the independence process.
When the Russians made that offer of 10,000 soldiers and $500 billion, honestly, I don't know if it was real or not. I don't think it was. But I understood that it was a way of trying to convince Puigdemont to take the next step.
After the meeting, they shook hands and Puigdemont said that he refused the offer. However, his inner circle continued to maintain contact with the Russians.
Our goal was to be recognized by major states once we had achieved independence, because the others would join the movement like a domino effect.
The next day, the news broke out.
La resolució de la declaració dels i les representants del Parlament queda aprovada per 70 vots a favor, 10 en contra i 2 vots en blanc.
The deputies in the autonomous region approved the independence of Catalonia. Was there a connection with the meeting the day before? Did the discussion with the Russians speed the process up?
These are coincidences. These events have nothing to do with each other. The president had planned to proclaim the Republic on the 27th in any case.
What worries me as a citizen is that on the eve of one of the most decisive days in Catalonia's recent history, the president of Catalonia welcomed Putin's representatives into his official residence. And that is a fully fledged act of interference.
The government in Madrid ultimately declared independence illegal. Carles Puigdemont fled to Belgium. And as the months went by with constant protests, the ties with the Russians continued as planned.
I believe that Russian interference in Spain is still ongoing, because Spain is a politically fragile country with many weak spots, and Russia knows how to take advantage of those weaknesses.
Following their involvement with Catalonia, the Russians turned their focus to a new target, France and its former colonies. On February 17, 2022, at the Élysée Palace, Emmanuel Macron made an announcement which was perceived as a victory for Russia.
Nous ne pouvons pas rester engagés militairement aux côtés d'autorités de fait dont nous ne partageons ni la stratégie ni les objectifs cachés. C'est la situation à laquelle nous sommes confrontés aujourd'hui au Mali. La lutte contre le terrorisme ne peut pas tout justifier.
The French president announced the end of the Barkhane operation in Mali, which aimed to fight terrorism in the Sahel region.
Qui s'inscrivent dans un temps long.
This decision was made due to the observation that the political and security conditions were no longer met to be able to fight against armed terrorist groups alongside the Malian armed forces.
The relationship between France and Mali had been tense for the past few months. Paris was regularly targeted in demonstrations and incidents like the obstruction of a Barkhane convoy by demonstrators. The growing anger towards France and Mali was linked to the presence of Yevgeny Prigozhin and his army of mercenaries known as Wagner, who are suspected of committing executions and rapes against civilians in the areas where they operate.
The tensions between France and Mali existed before the Russians arrived, of course. But once the Russians showed up, they exploited and took advantage of those tensions.
They deployed an opportunistic strategy aimed at ousting the French and ultimately extending Russian influence, because Wagner, in a way, can be seen as a sort of wing of the Russian army. What the Russians ultimately wanted was to become the sole point of contact in order to bring the country under their control, thus demonstrating a predatory approach.
Yevgeny Prigozhin and his associates, who are at the head of an immense media ecosystem in Africa, have made France a prime target. According to this internal document, the Russian development strategy on site planned to strengthen Russia's informational influence and promote independence from the West.
The important thing to know is that wherever Wagner goes, it serves a purpose. It's a triptych that consists of mercenary work, close protection, mineral exploration, resource extraction, be it oil, gold, diamonds, because they need funding and especially support on an information level. They have an entire ecosystem of media influence, which includes their activity on social networks where their troll factories operate.
The Russians created Facebook pages in the Sahel region where misinformation against the French was posted daily. The soldiers were accused, among other things, of stealing gold or providing food and motorcycles to terrorist groups.
Media outlets are in short supply on the African continent. So that opens the door for people to inform themselves much more on Facebook, Twitter, and other social networks.
There's a phenomenon of massive attacks, a kind of steamroller. They spread misinformation, and they relay it through pan-African movements, for example.
Nous sommes aujourd'hui dans un marécage, attrapés par un crocodile qui se nomme l'oligarchie française.
Among these powerful and influential pan-Africanist influencers on social media were Kemi Siba, a French activist, and Nathalie Yam, a Swiss Cameroonian.
La France tue plus que Covid, Ebola et Sida réunis.
Le Mali aujourd'hui est un grand corps malade, mais le médicament Barkhane est un faux médicament.
The Russians have realized that there are influential individuals who act as frontrunners, whose statements are quickly echoed by a second layer of people who retweet and reiterate the ideas put forward by these influencers.
As a result, Moscow's influence in Mali spread massively. Russian flags began to appear in the streets. Against a backdrop of heightened tension, French soldiers withdrew from the military base in Gossi, located in the central eastern region of the country, on April 19, 2022. At that precise moment, the Russians launched a new attack against the French. An attack launched on Twitter by certain Dia Diarra, who presented himself as a former Malian soldier turned political analyst, and who regularly accused France of committing crimes. In reality, the Russians, who had stolen the profile picture from a Colombian who signed up on VKontakte, were behind this troll account. On April 20th, he posted this message.
The footage of corpses from the Gossi base are awful. A crime against the Malian people committed by the French.
It's April 20th and it's 10 p.m. We came across a tweet and thought, okay, this could be the start of something. We weren't sure if it was just a baseless accusation or the first indication of something more significant. We decided to send aerial sensors over the Gossi region to investigate what was happening. But that night, nothing happened.
The following day, the French drone dispatched to monitor the Gossi base remained in operation, and it filmed the presence of vehicles that the French suspected of belonging to the Russians.
At that point, the aerial sensor detected a group of men burying bodies in a mass grave about 4 kilometers east of the Gossi area. We chose not to intervene to see what would happen.
At 12:51 on April 21st, a new tweet was posted from Dia Diarra's account. On this occasion, the post was a picture portraying partially buried bodies. 2 hours later, a third message appeared with a video.
Then a video of about 20 seconds came out showing a mass grave with bodies piled on top of each other with the caption accusing the French of committing these atrocities. What makes this particularly interesting and disturbing for us is that the video perfectly matches the footage captured by the aerial sensor, which shows a person circling the mass grave holding a camera or a video camera. There was a striking similarity between the content posted online by Dia Diarra and what was recorded by the French military censor.
France then decided to declassify documents and distribute them to the media for the first time in response to the Russian provocation.
So the decision was taken to act quickly and not let things escalate on the internet, because once that happens, it becomes very difficult to reverse the situation. In the digital world, the informational world, the first person to speak often sets the tone and can impose their narrative. Therefore, it's crucial to respond promptly and say what's true and what's false.
Following this, the Dia Diarra account was deleted. And when you search for mass grave Gossi on Google, it's the French version that comes up instead of the Russian one. This represents a victory for the French. But on social media, false claims about the mass grave were still gaining traction on social media. A huge surge of anti-French comments ensued.
For the first time, Paris felt that they had successfully exposed a collaborative effort to manipulate information between Wagner and the Malian junta. However, in the end, this revelation had little to no effect on a large number of Malians, who firmly believe in France's manipulative and double-dealing nature.
This propaganda was not only effective and captivating, but also had fatal consequences. Meanwhile, in Europe, Russia was intensifying its information war and now targeting civilians who are the primary victims of this warfare. April 1st, 2022, in Bucha, located a few kilometers west of Kyiv. The war had already been underway for 5 weeks.
Если вы говорите, что русские солдаты это люди.
On that day, a local resident stumbled upon the aftermath of the devastating month-long Russian occupation. On Yablonska Street, he filmed the unthinkable on his phone and shared it on his Instagram story. The footage showed several bodies lying on the ground, left unattended for weeks.
A city near Kyiv that was occupied by Russian troops. There, Russians executed many civilians. They committed war crimes. When Ukrainian troops entered Bucha, they found dead bodies all over the streets. They found executions, they found mass graves of civilians that the Russians executed.
With the withdrawal of Russian troops, the true loss of life they had left behind them was finally revealed for the first time since the start of the war. This story gained widespread coverage in international media outlets and became a symbol of the barbarity of the Russian war.
The official response from the Kremlin quickly followed as the whole world was left in a state of shock. They used the same denial mechanism that we saw in action after the initial bombings in Syria 7 years prior. This time, the lies were written out in a few short lines posted on the official Telegram and Twitter accounts of the Russian government.
They had to create an explanation for their own population. Because the Russians, they're still believing that this is a liberation operation.
In Bucha, citizens are not only suffering from the atrocities of war, but also the propaganda of a merciless information war of which they are the primary victims. Leonid Cherkassky stayed in the city during the Russian occupation. To fight the propaganda, he shares his experiences as a volunteer, collecting the dead bodies. There are so many that he's lost count.
We would take our van to the streets, where we could collect the dead. Some of us volunteers were ready to help, because not everyone was capable of picking up decomposing bodies, or bodies with the head caved in. So normal people cannot say that it's not true. They just cannot say it. And they do not have the right to do so. I wish the people who wrote that could look the victims in the eye.
Leonid knows quite a few of them. They were residents of Bucha, just like him, ordinary citizens who were trying to go from one place to another.
Most of the people who were killed were just passing by. They were ordinary citizens who were just going about their business, moving around, and they got shot by snipers.
Svetlana Bravchenko's husband, Volodymyr, was one of the victims of Russian snipers on Yablonska Street. He was killed while riding his bicycle.
On TV and YouTube, I keep seeing people saying that everything was staged, that it's all a fake. But how can they say that? My husband is no longer here. So what kind of staging are they talking about? People are gone.
Svetlana left Bucha at the start of the war, unlike her husband Volodymyr. It was only when she returned home weeks later that she found out her husband had been killed.
People told me they saw him leave on a bike. It didn't belong to him. He wanted to return it. A neighbor asked him where he was going, and he replied, to work. She warned him that the Russians were there, but he said, it'll be fine, and left. That was on March 5th.
Ukrainians have been living through victories and defeats against the Russian army since February 24th, 2022, as well as dealing with the spread of misinformation.
It is this emergency that caused us to open our eyes. So I can understand that the rest of the world has not quite opened its eyes yet. And I would just like to call upon them, do it quicker than we did, because propaganda is dangerous. It leads to real-life death.
The fight against lies and propaganda is still far from won, and is perhaps the most challenging battle for our democracies.